I grew up in Manchester. I saw shows, I saw pantomime, as we called it. I saw what really was the end of the music hall, which is called Variety. I saw circuses. I saw straight theatre. I was taken to see Shakespeare at an early age. I saw musical theatre. I saw all the great American musicals. But above all, I went to the pictures, to the movies. When I was growing up in the 40s, and particularly in the 50s when I was a teenager, you could see films all the time if they'd let you or if you could afford it. And there were little crummy cinemas all round. I mean, there were 14 cinemas walking distance from our house without even going into the centre of Manchester, so the big first release cinemas. And every cinema showed 2 movies at a time, you know. And so I grew up looking at British and American films. And movies were really my first passion. But I had a great fascination for theatre. In an atmosphere which was the early 1960s, which was buzzing with revolution and experiment of all kinds, as you know, I set about making my own work. Now, for the entire span of the 1960s, that was making theatre. I, throughout that period, wanted to make film. And from the early 70s onwards, throughout the 70s and into the very early 80s, I kind of alternated between filmmaking, mostly for television, and making theatre. But the truth is that my number one passion, my main commitment in life, and my natural habitat is movies. As to the relationship between theatre and film, I mean, so far as I'm concerned, personally, from a philosophical point of view, first of all, there's basically is what I call the circus factor, the danger factor. If you go to the circus and you are looking at the trapeze artist and you're actually there and you're displacing the same space as she is on the high wire, the danger, the actual danger that she will fall off and break her neck and you will be there is completely ineluctable and real. And that whole tension, that, you know, actually being there is the stuff of what theatre is. Because when you watch a play, it is, if you really buy into the fact that it's really happening and you start to believe in it totally and you're there, it's just very dangerous indeed. Now, for me, in movies, in making movies, I aspire to that condition. In other words, so that even though the audience objectively knows that they're looking at a flickering image on a two-dimensional screen, you know, if you start to believe in it, it has that same sense of reality and danger and total ineluctability. That's what we should aspire to. At the same time, conversely, when I put something on the stage, I want the audience to believe in their grain of reality, just as they would if they were looking at something filmed in the street. The truth is that for me, the whole possibility of being able to take this mechanical box and a whole group of people into the real world and breathe the real air and embrace and interface with the environment and to create something poetic and meaningful and dramatic and significant and that resonates with people's lives out of that is actually more exciting than creating an illusion inside a dead space. I mean, theatre at its best is very exciting indeed, and when the audience is laughing and crying and everyone's together there with the actors, it is very exciting indeed, but you can aspire to that in the movies, of course. But there is also something, for my taste, there is something insular and hermetically sealed and inward looking and devoid of fresh air about this building which is dark and where everybody's, you know, sort of in there, and it doesn't really need to relate to the outside world, whereas it's in the nature of filmmaking that you are part of the outside world. First of all, at the most obvious level, you know, the film is it, you know, and it will vary from performance to performance because of the different chemistry of audiences. Now that's true of plays, except the play varies as well, because there are good performances and bad performances, and, you know, some are better and some are worse and so on and so on. So there is that. But that, I don't worry about that, because that's in the nature of theatre. It's in the organic nature of the medium, so that's not a problem. Secondly, you and I can have a discussion here, which we are, about my early work, for example, and you can go away and access pretty well, all of my early films, because they exist. I can tell you about all the plays I did in the 1960s, for example, and you cannot go away and access them in any shape or form because they do not exist. They don't exist in fact, they don't exist on the stage, and they certainly don't exist on paper. They just don't exist. They're just no more than, you know, the ancient civilizations of the Aztecs. They just don't exist, right? And in a way, that is, again, in the nature of theatre, but you could regard it in some curious way as a curious disadvantage, if that's how you regard it. As a playmaker versus a filmmaker, just in practical terms, obviously, I have slightly different responsibilities. When I construct a stage play, it's absolutely essential that I take into consideration in the construction of the play itself the emotional route that the actor has to take from A to Z at each performance. And that has to be built into all the decisions I make about both dramatic, emotional and practical and everything else, physical and all of those. When I make a film, although obviously the emotional through line of the character, the journey of the character is very much something that I discuss with the actor, I don't have that same responsibility, because you can, you know, create a piece of action with an actor, and then you can, at another time, create another piece of action, and you can swap them over, and you can, you know, intercut them and do all sorts of things, and the actor doesn't have to have the worry of actually carrying the film in that same sense. So that's just a practical difference, but of course, as in the nature of all consideration and discussion about all art, the practicalities of the medium always impact on the decisions you make as to its meaning, because that is what art is about. Beyond that, theatre is very much redefined by its environment. Now, you could argue that a film shown in lousy circumstances is also distracting, but it doesn't alter the actual experience of the thing itself. So film is, in a sense, much more resilient and resistant to all those exigent forces. If you look at the plays of Shakespeare, which are very cinematic in a way, and great movies have been made of Shakespeare, the thing about why Shakespeare is brilliant and cinematic, and I learnt a lot when I worked in the 60s, at one stage as an assistant director at the Royal Shakespeare Company, working on the Shakespeare productions. As a writer, I learnt a lot, and let alone as a director. The thing about Shakespeare is he has this great way of manipulating time, you know. And in fact, if you listen to his prologue to Henry V, he actually encourages us to leap across time and imagine, you know, which is very cinematic. The thing about film that I love, and it's in the it's in my bloodstream, and it's why I'm passionate about movies, is that, you know, this moment can simply become that moment. you can take that moment and take this moment and stick them together and create a moment. You know. Whereas you actually can't do that in theatre for all Shakespeare's attempts at, you know, because in the end you are stuck in the real time of what's going on. And I hate scene changes. I hate sitting in a theatre while people run about in the dark, falling over each other with furniture. I'd love you want to just stick it together. So in a way, that's just me celebrating some of the good things about film as opposed to theatre. But when I do theatre, when you create something in the theatre medium, you don't think about those things, you embrace the medium in its own turn.